Great. So thank you everyone for joining today. Um, so my name is Ajay. I'm a partner at Pear Ventures. Pear is a pre-seed and seed stage venture capital firm, and our goal is to be the best partner for entrepreneurs who are just starting their companies and are going on the journey from 0 to 1, with the ultimate goal of building category-defining companies. So we've been doing the speaker series remotely since shelter in place. And today I'm really excited about our speaker. We have Nikhil Singhal, who is going to join and share some of his thoughts to our community. He's an expert both in startups as a CEO and in product management in scaling in large companies. He started 3 companies, 2 of which were acquired, one by IBM and the other by Google. He then did a 4-year stint at Credit Karma as a chief product officer, and he's currently at Facebook where he's a VP of product. So welcome, Nikhil.
Thanks, Ajay. Really appreciate the introduction and kind words, and happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's get started. Today we're talking about when, how, and why to add product management into your company. And it's a topic I'm particularly interested in, coming from a PM background and working in startups. I think it's not an easy set of questions. So when I was interviewing to be a PM, there's a question I got over and over again. So I'm going to start with an interview question for you, which is, what is the role of a product manager?
Yeah, I hope I pass. Product management is probably the most personal function to sort of tech companies that exist out there. I think that maybe I'll start by maybe saying that it depends, and that which is in contrast to something like sales or engineering, which actually are pretty consistent, whether they're smaller, medium, or larger companies. And the reason why is that the function itself is, when it's early, is really focused on helping the company get to product market fit. And then once the company has product market fit, the the focus of the discipline changes pretty dramatically, and it moves from a how do you ensure that the company the train's kind of moving down the tracks correctly, to how do you move to a place where it can scale and it can then become an innovation area. And so, maybe to be more precise, the product manager that exists, for example, at a company like a Google, is really different than a product manager or the product management function at a company that's just getting off the ground. And certainly the ones in between are kind of a third group. So we can talk a little bit more about the distinctions, but the commonalities are usually connecting people to each other, communicating strategy and vision, ensuring some predictability as to where the company is going, and really a partnership to the technology discipline, the engineering discipline, and even the sales and marketing discipline. So those are usually the commonalities, but the area of investment and depth varies quite a bit depending on how far along the company is.
Got it. Yes, I know you've written a lot about this subject. So one of the things that you've put out there that I have referenced over and over again is how you break the startup life cycle into 4 stages. And I really reference your graph a lot for our early stage companies because I think it's very logical and clear. So I was hoping you could walk us through those 4 stages.
Yeah, I think that what I find is, and it sort of maybe alludes to the question you asked, is that oftentimes when it comes to career advice for product managers or adding product management into an organization, or just even thinking through, other disciplines like marketing and or even financing strategies, it oftentimes is, I always kind of refer back to this classic S curve. So think about an S curve and break it into sort of 4 parts depending on where you are on the curve. So at the very beginning, this phase that I like to call the Drunken Walk phase exists. And Drunken Walk is sort of like, you're starting, you've got this sort of vision in your mind, and the founders and the initial team are kind of working through what works and what doesn't work, and you're trying to find effectively a recipe that the market likes. And the goal in this case is to move through this sort of drunken walk phase as quickly as possible. And the reason why I refer to it as drunken walk is you kind of go left for a little while and then you realize that product that you're building isn't quite working, and then you kind of throw it away and you move right and then you move left, and the faster you move through it, the more you start to see, the line kind of straighten out, if you will. And I think that the challenge when you're in this sort of drunken walk is that you're really trying to move as quickly as possible and iterate and effectively throw away code, if you will, as fast as humanly possible, right? Well, then there's a point in time when maybe sometimes I use this fire analogy, which is like you've been trying to start the fire and all of a sudden you see the smoke start to build and you're like, wow, okay, those two sticks rubbing together seems to be working. And now all of a sudden everyone gathers around that smoke and their hope is to get that smoke into flames,
Mm.
right? And if the flames start, is to protect it from the elements and make sure that it continues to kind of germinate. Now, the funny thing is that the if you just look around the sort of settlement of all these people rubbing sticks and all of a sudden one person starts to see smoke and then everyone crowds around, the discipline is very different. Now it's not to experiment and find new ways to create smoke, it's all to protect. So that transition is fairly profound. And when we talk about product management, the transition between trying to experiment and trying to protect could not be more different. And so the personalities of the entrepreneur now becomes one of maybe more of a process-oriented individual. Then you move to the next phase, which is, man, things are working, the flame is going. And now your hope is, how do you take advantage of the fact that you've got this heat and you've got this great fire going? And in that case, your concern is less about protecting, but it's more about expansion. And so most of these quote unquote hyper growth companies, which are growing much, much faster than they were, say, 10 years ago, because now you really can grow with the App Store, with the Play Store, with, ads on a Facebook or a Google. You have the ability to move very, very quickly up the sort of up the scale curve. And so when you're in that situation, your fear is that you don't take advantage of this moment in time. It's the Uber's got this service that's going great and they're moving from black to pool to, X to pool, et cetera. But they also want to figure out, maybe I can use this for delivery service like Uber Eats. And so the product management function to the company is going through this next phase, which is, boy, we're just growing like gasoline and, we're putting as much on the fire. How do we take advantage of widening what we are known for, what the product can do? And then the last phase is this sort of hyperscale phase where you're market leader. And at that stage, actually your time is spent mostly trying to start the next S curve. It's
Mm.
to start to go back to the beginning and actually innovate again. I think that that's one of the reasons why a lot of leaders are attracted to mature products like myself at Facebook and working within the main app and the newsfeed. It's partly my attraction was, what are the next new things that one can plant when you're already at scale? And it's kind of product management becomes not only a way to maintain scale, but also to start innovation again. And that's, kind of the cycle repeating itself.
Um, so I love that. The vast majority of the companies we work with at Pair are in the drunken walk stage, and I think it's a great way to describe the phase, because 1 week things are going great, and the next week you realize it's a total dud, and you just do something all over again. So in that phase specifically, you've written that product management is really project management, and it really made me think. I thought that was really curious. I'd love to hear more about why you see it that way.
Yeah. So I think that there's product managers and then there's the discipline of finding product fit. So let me see if I can tease those apart, because I think those are slightly different. So we can agree that at the beginning of the company, everyone in the organization's, effectively sole goal is to find a product that people want. And, my definition is not just a product that people want, but people want, and the value of those customers are more than it costs to bring them in the door. So if we're in a restaurant, it's that, hey, I spend $2 to bring a customer in and I make $3. Hey, I think I have something working, I can scale it. If it costs me $5 to bring someone in to the restaurant and I only make $2, then either you have to hope that you can get 2 to 7, or you have to kind of continue to figure out a way to kind of noodle on the product or noodle on the acquisition strategy. So we're in this mode where everyone's working on these kind of like, how do I get people in and how do I ensure that they stay and that they continue to be valuable to me? Now, what I find is that usually in most sort of tech companies, the founding team is responsible for ownership and decisioning around product fit. And partly it's just based on the compensation models. You know, the founders just have a lion's share at stake. They're usually the executives in the team. They're usually the ones that have the lion's share of ownership. They're the ones that the investors have really placed money in. And the extended team in some ways just aren't at the same level and scale as the founders. And so the reason why I make the comment around product managers typically end up owning project management initially is that, you know, if you think about the goal is to figure out how to move forward and where to aim, right? Then how to move forward is a team question. Like, you know, how do I ensure that we're shipping at the right time? How do we ensure that the quality measurement's good? How do we make sure that we're not building things too much to scale before they actually are tested in the market? That's a team question. But then the founders are really like, where do we aim? What direction? How long do we stick it out before we change and take another step? And the dynamic that I worry about is, you know, startups kind of come in and they're struggling with product management and they are sorry with product direction and product fit. And they come in and they say, well, we need to bring in product managers. They'll solve the problem. And, you know, that's a really tough place when a product manager in that drunken walk phase is having to think strategically. Because now what you end up doing is you perhaps are a great counsel and partner to the founders, and perhaps the dynamic could work. So I'm not saying it can never work, but the compensation model are dramatically off. The risk is effectively the same. So, you know, the company hasn't really had product fit. The founders are making a disproportionate amount of ownership of the company. The product manager comes in, he or she is responsible for figuring out where do we now take it. You know, the team is essentially beholden to the founders, the investors as well. The dynamic is very, very challenged. And so the big fail that I suggest to people is, you know, if you're a product manager and you're coming into an organization that doesn't have product fit and the founders see themselves as sort of owning it, but maybe not being great at it, it's a pretty tough place to be.
Mm.
On the other hand, you know, as you noted, oftentimes what you really want is that team to own the execution and the efficiency and predictability of what's being built. And that isn't necessarily an obvious thing that happens as you have 6, 8, 10 engineers, for example. They may be building products and they may not have the ability to think through what's the right process. How do we ensure predictability? How do we, you know, measure quality? How do we connect this to what's happening with the users? And the founders, though they may know what type of product they want to build and what market to go after, they may not actually be experts or even have the time to invest in the executional aspects of it. So I actually embrace this. And I actually suggest that, look, there's no shame in saying that we need to bring in product managers to really own a lot of the execution. We'll call that project management here. I
Mm.
actually think that that creates the right incentive model because project management is much more of a utility than a strategic function. It is a necessary function. Someone needs to do it. And it actually speeds up iteration, which are all good things. It's just not a strategic function. And oftentimes when we think of product managers, they're like, well, they're the CEO of the product. Well, you got a CEO of the product. That's the CEO of the company. But, you know, figure that out and make sure that there's no overlap there. And I think it leads to some better hygiene.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Um, so shifting gears just slightly for a second, you've been a CEO twice. You've been through the drunken walk. It's painful. Many of our companies, many of our attendees, I'm sure, are in that process. Do you have any lessons that you would apply to, you know, a third company that you would start, for example, or lessons for future the current founders about how to get out of the drunken walk?
It's a tough question because, you know, if I knew that, I probably wouldn't be working at scale. um, I I think that, you know, the few things that I would say is, um, one thing I've learned is that there is some value to healthy naivety. So there's a reason why more seasoned, more experienced people tend to have less success at early stage than people that are maybe earlier in their career.
Hmm.
And I think that is an important thing for most of your teams to sort of embrace. Um, Whenever I've taken on a product area, I've started out fairly naive and completely oblivious to the space. And what I found was that I relatively quickly were able to grok kind of conventional wisdom, but because I didn't have the insider perspective, the sort of jaded, that'll never work, the kind of scars on the back of trying to kind of, solve problems, you end up like doing a bunch of boneheaded things. 80% of them are probably easily avoided if you had been down the road, and 20% of them you would have avoided and actually turn out to be the right thing. When I started Say Now, which was a company that Google acquired, we started to see a trend where the product we were building, which was almost like a voice Twitter, where we had phone numbers, that product we put out on MySpace, kind of dates me as to how long ago this was, and we started to see musicians really take advantage of it as a way to connect with their fans. Now, I knew nothing about the music industry. And, if I did know as much as I perhaps eventually learned and what conventional wisdom said, we wouldn't have touched that thing with a 10-foot pole. Music industry was really struggling. They were losing sales from CDs. Everyone was grumpy. I remember going down to LA and meeting a lawyer type person, and he just drew out how the even music industry worked. I mean, it was literally like music for dummies.
Yeah.
Within 3 years, we were kind of the experts in dealing with music and digital. And so what I think that the lesson, if I was to pick one, is that healthy naivety is a critical element to finding product fit, and actually fortitude around some of those ideas that, hey, the world should work this way. I don't quite understand why the industry doesn't, but I want to focus on that user, that business problem, and go forward on it. I think actually means more than people realize, and I think that it's a note to be able to encourage people to work through hardship, because I think the whole time you have imposter as you're going through these new markets that you don't know any business in going through. But if I've spent so much time with founders, usually their story is, I knew nothing about this, and now in a couple of years, I'm one of the experts. I'm like, well, it actually happens more often than we realize. So that would be my top point of counsel.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Okay, so back to bringing in PMs into your startup. You've said that, at an early stage company, you can bring on a PM too early or too late. And I think we've covered the too early example in the previous question. But too early or too late is a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? So like, how do you avoid that mistake and pick the right time? And when is that right time?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the stage and the growth of the company and the identity and the inklings of the founding team. So what I would say is that as the company starts to grow, it becomes important for the company to scale the people that can drive growth and ideation and strategy and execution for the product, which is why product management needs to exist at some point in the organization. But there are companies which find themselves with founders who are very, very kind of aware and deep in that background. And in that case, there is less of a need for it as long as there's execution predictability and as long as the engineering and the marketing and the business teams feel connected, right? So these are the things that if I was to do like pulse surveys, I'd be very focused on, do we understand why we're building what we're building? Do we understand that across the organization? And is there a clarity and predictability of what's happening? And do the founders continue to enjoy and have strength in being able to drive that? If the answer is yes, then product management is certainly not too late at that stage. As a reference point, WhatsApp was effectively a standard for big chunks of the world in messaging, and they were what, 36, 37 employees,
Yeah.
and they got bought for, a very sizable amount from Facebook, north of $15 billion, and they had no product manager. So there is no ratio, there is no scale of company. I mean, it's pretty obvious that companies can do, remarkably well without the definition of product management. But in their case, they had very strong founders who had a really tight, clear vision, and their engineering team actually felt like they were connected to that vision and they were able to work through the problems. And there wasn't a necessity for that function. The function was effectively being handled by the technical team that pre-exists as well as a founding team. But what the most common case that I see is when you start seeing the needs of the founders grow to be less focused on product fit
Yeah.
and more on scaling the organization. And that could be establishing new functions. Hey, customer support, we don't know anything about that. It seems like we have customers though. We should probably solve that. Or fundraising, or thinking through acquisition. Marketing is an important area. Thinking through company culture, depending on if the company starts to scale, multiple locations, and dealing with scaling the organization, which oftentimes happens sooner these days than later, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As the what I call the as the executive team founders move from product fit experts to executives of the organization, it's at that point where you start to see this sort of transition. And that's the point where if you fail to bring in product management, you'll see dramatic reduction in efficiency. You'll see dramatic reduction in culture because people will stop knowing what's getting done, why we're doing what we're doing. And you'll also see that just the quality of what's being delivered will start to be, much weaker. These are all telltale signs that perhaps we need, sort of the product manager who knows this stage of company the best, and that's where I would ask to insert it.
Yeah, so I've seen this phase happen in companies, and I've noticed that um, people tend to like to work on things that they're good at. So if you were a founder, you're focused on product, you achieve product market fit and things growing. I found that for some founders, they have a tough time stepping away from day-to-day product work. Um, it's their baby, right? So do you have any advice on how to make that transition? Not just that you have to make that transition, but the actual process of it.
This is such a deeply personal question for the founders. And I think that, for example, I would say that a company like Facebook or a company like Google, the founders, Larry and Sergey, as well as Mark in the Facebook case, were pretty engaged in the product for quite some time. And the products actually have done quite well. So it would be a little bit remiss to sort of say there's a point in time where you must step back. I think that it's almost like a psychological question around like, what is the person's career ambition as a founder? Do they see themselves as moving into a traditional executive role? Shall we call it CEO or head of sales or head of product one day, et cetera? If the goal of the person is to expand beyond product, then I think that the question really deserves quite a bit of weight, because then it's like, well, eventually you want to run the company, you don't want to run the product. So if you're basically the CPO, but the company needs a CEO, we need to fix that.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really tough emotional decision where you need to find either individuals you trust, or you need to find a way to introduce enough process that allows you to continue into some strategic role and then allow a lot of the actual heavy lifting to take place in the team. On the other hand, I think that founders that come in and say, actually, I just don't want to be that CEO and I would rather be the CPO. I think that then once the product starts to see product fit, I think there's significant merit to actually going and running that search earlier rather than later, and then actually slotting into the long term. Where I think the nature of the question is really, most poignant is when you have a person who's strong in product, who is not a strong CEO, who wants to be a CEO because that's the best way to maintain control,
Mhm.
who's essentially doing an average to weak job as CEO and increasingly a poorer job as the product leader, particularly when you're at scale, particularly when you've got dozens of teams and maybe multiple product lines. The combo is wicked. And that's the thing that you need to be talking to the board about pretty early, because I think that is that step back moment. And I think it's really clarity around what does good look like downstream, which kind of helps figure out what's the correct today's problem to solve.
Have you seen the opposite of this problem where you have a founder who, where product is not their expertise? Maybe there's some other expertise like marketing, go to market, engineering, any other of these things. Have you seen that, and how would you advise such founders to think about the product role?
Yeah, and I think that this is more common, not less common going forward. So as like I may make a quick a side note and then come back to the question. I think it's unusual. Like 30 years ago, I think what companies were kind of, when we thought of tech, we thought of like semiconductors, and we thought of networking, and we thought of like infrastructure type stuff. And
Right.
so the concept of starting like the next chip company or the next networking company, or, even the next search company, I think was kind of foreign to the idea of someone who didn't understand product and technology to actually have in point of view. And so increasingly, we saw founders being engineering oriented, tend to be technical, tend to have a really strong level of product, because most of the opportunity was in building the foundation, and most of the challenge to product fit was technical in nature. Okay. So now if you look in the last 10 years, there's a point in time where um, the sort of the market tipped, meaning that a product like an Uber or an Airbnb can be built relatively quickly with the platforms that exist, between the cloud-based platforms, the software-based platforms, the ability to kind of connect pieces and very quickly try things out in, say, the app store and website through marketing. You just see the ability to, for a non-technical person to have an innovation, say in healthcare or in finance or in education, areas that don't have a lot of innovation. You just see people being able to be very credible. But they may not necessarily be technical, or they may not even have really an understanding of that product fit. My sense is that 10 years ago, I would say that's a rough place to be. Um, Today, I think that it's actually increasingly becoming the norm, particularly as we start seeing growth outside of, say, the Bay Area for really successful companies, both internationally as well as great companies coming out of the Midwest and other parts of the country sort of seeing success. What I would say to those folks is, I think that, and this is heavily probably biased, is that the speed to be able to go through product fit is so essential for being able to efficiently get to the destination and the final course of action for the company, that purely outsourcing that, purely hoping that your team is going to be able to figure that out, feels like a very tough proposition. So what I would instead do is actually suggest that if you're not the person who's owning product fit, and you agree that product fit is sort of job number one, I wouldn't say hang up and live to fight another day. I would say is find a co-founder who can be essentially the owner of product fit. The reason why I use the term co-founder is I think the economics need to work. And so going back to my point earlier, is the reason why bringing in a product manager was rife with challenge is that it's this dual sword, which is, hey, I think I'm working on the problem that I think is most critical, but I think that at the end of the day, I have 0.2% of the company, which is going to get diluted over the next 3 rounds. It doesn't feel like it's that much more additive than if I was to maybe found my own company. I could get maybe 10% of the company or 20% of the company. Like, why would I do this? So my counsel is Sure, take the co-founder chair, get the kind of economics if you can solve product fit problem, ensure that people listen to you because you have a very small leadership team in that case. And I think that if I was a non-technical founder and product fit was critical and I wasn't going to own it, I should feel comfortable in parting ways with part of my equity to ensure that that piece is important, because 98% of companies or more, you probably know the numbers better than me, would struggle to find product fit. So you might as well reduce that risk with equity if you can.
Yeah, I totally agree. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit about once you've achieved product fit and you're trying to recruit PMs. One thing that you've said is look for product people who will scale with the org if you can. And I remember when you were at Credit Karma, we were talking back then, you were extremely purposeful about how you wanted to build a team. And I'm curious about some of the lessons that you learned in terms of like what skill set do you look for to identify the types of people who can scale with a growing organization?
Yeah. So the backdrop of this is that, there are two growth curves that are taking place in any situation of employment. One is the growth curve of the company, and the other is a growth point of the individual. And what you should think through as you think through career and company is that you should think through what happens when they're perfectly in lockstep and what happens when they're off. Well, what happens when they're perfectly lockstep is most times people end up being pretty happy. And that means that if the company is not particularly growing and they're still struggling to find product fit, but the individual in and of itself is also is not necessarily growing and saying that I need to be a manager, I need to be an executive, I need to be a strategist, it's totally fine. I think that what you end up seeing is the challenges exist when the person's growing and they're like off to a terrific career, but then the company starts to crest.
Hmm.
And then it's like, well, let me understand this. Like in the next 2 years, if I was to plot this out, I'm probably not going to have more than one product to work on. And I'm probably not going to be in a management position more than one or two people. And I'm not sure that I'll get an opportunity to really think through the outside of the building problem as aggressively as I want. That's where the challenge lies. So the question is, if your goal or if you expect that the company is going to grow quickly, then you need to find folks that can grow as quickly. And if your goal is to find folks, if your worry or your expectation is, look, the company needs someone that's more solid, who may not necessarily be able to grow, but then I want to layer on the right people at the right time. That's the other model here. And I'll be more specific here in a second. Then I think that you're less focused on the growth path of the individual and more focused on setting expectations with the individual. So let me use an example. So in a company, for example, that's growing, that let's say we're at Series B and we're starting to add product managers that need to be very process oriented. The smoke is going, we need to get fire. You essentially have two choices. Choice number one is you want to hire someone who is kind of a little bit of the force of nature. They're super hyper organized. They were an ex-engineer or they're an engineer today at their current company, and they find themselves like on this fast track. They're really thoughtful about communication and they just want to execute. And they're early, they haven't had a ton of career success in product management or project management, but at the same time, you're pretty sure that, she's going to join and within a couple of years, she's going to be able to kind of think of the next product or work with the sales team, et cetera. This is your up and comer. Now, that person is an awesome person to hire, but the problem will be if the company doesn't grow. If the company doesn't grow, you've got the signs of someone who can like go from ignorance to expert in 6 months. You've got a track record of someone who has not had much trouble solving an ambiguous problem in the past. And you have someone who has the EQ and the communication chops to move forward. Your burden is if you don't grow in the next 12 to 18 months, you're going to have a challenge. Okay, so now you got a second example. Second example is you bring in someone that you have a second resume. Person's been a project manager slash early product manager at two scaled companies, let's say Microsoft and Oracle. Two examples, or maybe they are Google and they are Twitter or something like that. So you've got some companies that are like, okay, I'm pretty sure that they've learned what that project management type thing is going to be, but you've noticed that they really haven't been promoted very much in their career. So they've gone through maybe one or two step changes, but they aren't really going to, your expectation based on the resume is the chance that they're going to be director leading a team in 5 years is low, just because of the career trajectory of the individual. Well, so the question then is like, oh, you definitely don't want to hire that person, right? No, that's not true at all. No, in this example, what you kind of have to think through is you want to bring this person on board because you're pretty sure they'll do exactly the job that you have in mind, and they'll do a pretty darn good job of it, but they won't be able to scale if the company starts to scale. So the thing that you worry about in this case is setting expectations that they're going to be the product leader over time, because the track record is they haven't been able to grow. And so what I'm trying to adjust for is I kind of know what I'm getting. I think that if I communicate that, look, as the company grows, we want to augment the team with skills. We want to have a diverse group. We want to have people that know strategy, that know customer, that maybe know the domain, and obviously know execution. But we can't guarantee that that'll always be you, but we can guarantee we communicate pretty openly about it. But your growth curve has to match the company. And in that case, if the person's like, yeah, I would love to be in a smaller company and do this thing, it's a fantastic answer. It's the expectations, it's the past history, and it's kind of where you need to and how to communicate where the company's going. That's the match that I find the most helpful here.
That's really helpful. I have just one question on the hypergrowth phase. Most of our companies are not at that stage, but since you've seen it and we have you, when you're in the hypergrowth phase, what are some of the most common problems with product management orgs that you see and that you've had to kind of work through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the consistent patterns that I've seen from CPOs that are dealing with hypergrowth is that the teams start with, like, they're in this phase, which is to protect and maintain, um, smoke to fire. And what all of a sudden happens is hypergrowth doesn't happen over 5 to 10 years. Hypergrowth happens in like 6 months, meaning that you kind of bend the curve almost instantly. And so, I was talking to one of the early folks at LinkedIn, and they made a comment to me that I really resonated. They said, LinkedIn took 10 years, Uber took 18 months to make the same growth, and it was like 1 decade apart from one another. And I think that that's a really powerful point, because what it effectively says is that, okay, I've got this team. It's really good at making sure that we know where we're going. They communicate, they keep everyone informed. And all of a sudden it's like, what's my next product? 6 months now, I have, like, the board's like, hey, we are in the black. We got to invest in the business. What's our next thing? Are we going to do an acquisition? Are we going to hire 50 people? It's a totally different game, right? So usually when the CPO gets dropped into an organization and the company's in hypergrowth, these sometimes happen at the same time. The question is, what's gotten us here isn't what gets us there. And that means that the company has to go through change, but whatever the company has started with, Drunken Walk and protecting kind of product fit, is now needs to develop this new muscle. So oftentimes when you're in hypergrowth, the product management team is, most of them are in their first or second jobs, to be very tangible. But innovation at scale oftentimes requires people that have worked at scale and been early stage. And this innovator at scale is this sort of profile that you need. So at that stage, you're in this very, very aggressive process of adding people to the team, maintaining the existing team, changing what product management is defined as being a incremental versus an innovation function. And then you're also trying to change the power dynamics of the organization, where, as we've talked about, founders are usually driving strategy and direction. Each of the executives are newer, or they're potentially getting to a place where they're hitting some edges in the scale of their job. And so as the leader of that organization, or as the product management function, you're bringing a lot of new people along, and you're explaining what product is. You're explaining what the challenges are. Probably the biggest challenge is just things take way longer. It's like crazy. It's like, imagine a founder that's like, I used to be able to deliver a new project or new idea into the product in 3 weeks. Now it's taking me 5 months. What happened? It must be because we've become bureaucratic, bloated, et cetera. It's like, no, when you got to measure 9 times and cut once. Sometimes when you're late stage, it does take long. So this education and this cultural change and bringing people along and being strategic are all the interesting parts of hypergrowth. It's one of the most interesting parts of a phase, in my opinion.
I have two more questions, and then I think we'll open up to some Q&A from
Sure.
the audience. So as founders, you're not just responsible for product, right? You're responsible for the whole company. And I tend to think of product orgs as, PM, product management, engineering, and design. And I'm wondering, some of this that I read, I think also could apply to some of the other orgs, but I'm wondering from your perspective, how did you interact with the other functions in product in companies that are scaling?
Yeah, I think that it's some of it's cultural and some of it's depending on, like, consumer versus enterprise. I mean, what I would say in consumer companies, increasingly the four functions that tend to be tied at the hip are, product engineering almost always are tied. Design tends to be very heavily tied, particularly in consumer, and increasingly analytics tends to be very heavily, tied. I think that in many ways there's a blurring between these even functions. The strongest engineering managers, for example, oftentimes are driving product direction. The strongest analytics folks are oftentimes in product, and product managers are, kind of on the whiteboard helping think through interaction design. So there's a blurring between these four functions, if you will. I think that when you move to enterprise, I think that the role of sales and marketing actually kind of land a hell of a lot more than what we've typically seen in consumer, because there's a lot more math in consumer. There's a lot less math and a lot more trying to understand exactly what the customer is saying, and you can actually ask. You can't really ask in the case of consumer. So what I feel like is, product tends to essentially sit between the power functions of the organization as it deals with scale and growth. So if it's analytic and marketing oriented, so Credit Karma, for example, and most fintech, all of the game in fintech is sort of what we call CAC to LTV, which is how much does it cost to bring in someone, how much are they worth. So what you end up finding is the power functions of those organizations are marketing, analytics, and product engineering. But if you're in an enterprise company, when I did an enterprise software company, sales, product were kind of the tied at the hip, and engineering was heavily involved because of, how do you scale beyond the first 10 customers was constantly on products of mind, right? So it's just a different kind of layering depending on these functions, but usually product is definitely not just engineering in nature.
Okay. Last question that I had was to go back to your definition of product market fit, which is to say that the value of each user is greater than the cost of bringing them into the product. And it really got me thinking. I thought about this a lot after I read it. I'm curious how you arrived at this conclusion. To me, your definition anchors a lot on what I would call like acquisition channels, right? Like a lot on, do I have an efficient channel? Not as much on, do the people love our product and are they sticking around with on the product? And so, not to push back, but I'm curious how you arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to just be precise on my definition, it is as simple as how much does it cost to bring in someone into my restaurant and how much are they worth to me over time, right? So that's my sense. What I'm trying to protect for, as a way to answer the question, is I'm trying to protect for a situation where you put gas on the company too early or too late. So to me, that's the main concern, particularly as it relates to product. Too early is the most common case. It's we raise some money, we start driving a lot more people into the product. Those people aren't really that valuable. And instead of trying to make those customers more valuable, we're instead trying to add more people to the product. And the math that I'm watching is not that different from your point around love. Like if your point is that, well, I don't want to necessarily keep adding people unless they love my product, I'm like, well, we're actually pretty aligned. Love is defined as their worth. The product is worth something to them. And whether it's churn mechanics, whether it's they're willing to pay, whether it's I can bring someone in and the bigger the number, the network, the more valuable the product is, whatever definition is, there's a consistency there. Too late is also the case, meaning that if you've got a product where people not only like it, or maybe that they like it but they don't love it, but the fact is that you can bring them in relatively cheaply, meaning that they're willing to pay and it's not that expensive to acquire. We see this in like India and some other places where acquisition is relatively low. I think that you should be putting gas on it. And gas basically means that the product has to be thinking about growth in its sort of uh, focus when you're in that scenario. How do I grow? What are the frictions? How do I drive that forward? So for me, that's the reason why I'm noting it. And I think that, depending on how cheap money is in the industry, I think that we tend to fluctuate when we put gas on things and when we don't. And I'm trying to protect more for, I don't think it matters how inexpensive or expensive the money is. I think it matters as to, you never want to drive people to the product when you don't have a sense that you have something working. And working is very much part and parcel with the definition that I shared with you.
I could not agree more. Yeah, I think that makes it's a big mistake when people try to scale when it's not working yet. Great, Nikhil, this was fantastic. I think let's open it up to questions. We'll take a few here. There's a Q&A feature here, everyone. If people want to chime in with some questions, that'd be great. And we can have Nikhil answer them. We have one here, so why don't we try to take a look. Should a startup pursue a single product or multiple product strategy from day one? Do you have any examples on the two approaches and outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big think big, act small kind of guy. So I feel like it's really hard to pursue more than one product, but it's easier to pursue multiple tactics to go after a common vision, right? So I like the Uber example because it's just so easy to understand. Perhaps there's a variation in the industry that you're in, but I think that I sometimes, and perhaps, I mean, people have corrected me and said that this is closer to the Lyft vision, but for being editorial here, I kind of feel like when Uber got started, I think you can kind of look at that and say they saw a vision of reinventing transportation. And they saw that the way to do that was to go after this sort of driver ecosystem where you could take people that were able to drive but weren't actually making money and actually bring them into the workforce, and that people wanted, taxis were just essentially far from where people really wanted to go, and mobile was going to really make a huge transformation. And what you could have argued is they could have built all the products they have today. But what they really did is they were super, super smart, in my opinion, about starting small but maintaining a vision. So they started with Black, and Black was essentially a good wedge, but it wasn't really the product that they had long-term in mind. Let's say Uber X is the product they had in mind. But I think the discipline that they showed with saying that we want to invent transportation, we're going to start with passenger drivers, we're going to then start with Black because it's a pre-existing, then eventually get the right product that we want, which is X, closer to probably what Lyft was. And then we'll end up expanding into things like Eats and potentially into finance and other areas. That is thinking big, acting small. And my fear is that if you've got, limited resources and no product fit, trying to take three products after it, let's use those three as an example, you'd probably do a pretty bad job at all of them. And that's why I would avoid that.
So it's not that you don't do them, it's that even if they're interlinked, you kind of phase it out, so you build the infrastructure over time.
Yeah, it's just sort of an amplified point around, there's no company that failed when they, by being too focused. It's always about, being hyper, hyper, hyper focused on your starting point. And so that's where I would keep pushing back and say, is there a way to start with one? Is there a way to start with one? And, what do we gain and what do we lose by doing two is really what it comes down to.
One of the questions that's here and we see frequently is when you're in the drunken walk phase, uh, one of the challenges is how do I know that the current iteration of the thing I'm working on is not working? And the reason that's a question is because I have so few resources. I've put out such a crappy version of the product out. Maybe if I just make it better, it'll keep working. I'm curious if you have any advice on saying, hey, this is like definitely not working. Let's move on.
That's like it's a fantastic question, and I think every company ends up having to go through that. And it's the sort of the analogy I use is like, you're in Texas and you're drilling for oil and you haven't found it. How do you know it's not 10 feet away?
Yeah.
Right. And the answer, that question is in perpetuity. Like it'll always be potentially 10 feet away. I think that that's where you get paid for judgment. And I think that the guide that I suggest, as we've talked about, is, does it feel like there's line of sight that people would actually like it enough that they would provide more value than it would take to get them? Like that, to me, that's the question I'm always having in my mind. It's just, it is a judgment call. But, I look back and I think about the business models that, like say now is in, which is, if I would have been more critical to say now, I would have said, okay, lots and lots of people are calling in and we're actually seeing engagement. Not entirely sure how to monetize this, but let's say that we can acquire people really, really inexpensively. But then you're like, the way you acquire people inexpensively is you get celebrities to use your service, and it's very hit driven. So you would need like a celebrity every 3 to 6 months to really endorse your product in order for this business to work, versus like abandoning this and building an iPhone app that maybe is push to talk. Totally different, right? So this is the, do I do one or two? And, in retrospect, you could have probably asked that question and say, what's the likelihood that you would be able to find a celebrity every 3 months to endorse your product with the incentive system that exists? And the answer is pretty unlikely. It's like really hard to get like a hit. Like if you're a entertainment company, or if you're an artist and you want to be able to have a hit every 3 months on the radio, it's pretty unlikely. If we needed a hit, the equivalent of which was a hit, we needed to be a hit driven business, and it's just very hard to scale those. So I probably in that example should have like abandoned course and pivoted. But I didn't, because I didn't ask myself that critical question, because the product was working, but it wasn't working enough to scale. And that to me is like that critical level would have been important to me.
I think we'll do one more question. We're just about out of time. One I think you can answer, which is, I've heard the CPO can be thought about as the PM of PMs. What are your thoughts? What's the importance of the CPO if the PMs are the ones spearheading and executing on the products?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a good question. I think that CPO is usually that. Let's just frame the definition of CPO for a second. CPOs typically are, come into a company when they're in this growth phase or beyond, and they're the ones that sitting on the executive team, partnering with the founding team, driving strategy, articulating direction, and trying to take vision of the company and translate it out. I think that what you find in those organizations is there's usually multiple layers of product management. And so there is like 2 or 3 hats that the individual holds. One hat is they're the product representative on the executive team. And that's largely what I just described as the one driving the sort of strategy execution, communication on the strategy and vision to the tactics of what's in the market. I think the second is they are in charge of the product organization. That's, I think, the question alludes to. Their directs are usually product managers, and those product managers are often VPs or directors who are owning the whole, an entire product. Sometimes they are managing general managers, depending on how the organization is structured. And those general managers are sort of more directly CEOs of the product. PMs are more indirectly CEOs of the product, but less by authority and more by responsibility. So you've got a second hat that the product leader owns, which is how do I manage the product execution and the leadership of the organization. And then the third often is a spiritual and cultural hat, which is where is the company going? What is the company's perspective on innovation, on inclusivity when it comes to the product? What is the expansion path? What are the big moves that the company is willing to take risk on? Where should the company be investing from an acquisition, an M&A perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So this is like a third very strategic function, which is oftentimes the CPOs are outsiders. And so they're coming in with new kind of cultural ideas, which are sort of now held in balance. So you've got this cultural ambassador on, particularly on innovation, this execution manager of the product organization, and then there's this sort of executive hat of leading the strategy for the organization. All three, I think, are requirements for that CPO role.
Well, fantastic. Nikhil, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much. This is really great. I know we could talk for hours about product and product management. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. I hope everyone's staying safe, and it was a real pleasure to have a chance to both connect with you, Ajay, and Per, as well as just hear a little bit from what's going on in the portfolio. So I hope we get a chance to do it again.
Thank you so much.
All right, my pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.